Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello everyone, hello dear listeners. Welcome to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. We're recording this on Wednesday, the 14th of December, and my name is Alex Hokuli. I'm in São Paulo, Brazil. This is the last BungaCast of 2022, and what a year it's been. We left the pandemic behind to encounter war and inflation. We'll be back in the new year with some reflections on the major themes of 2022 with our guest Ashley Frawley. But for today, I'm here with Philip Cunliffe, but I should note George Hoare is away. Hi, Phil.
Hey, how's it going?
Now, before we get started, I want to apologize. We've had some exceptional technical difficulties today, so my sound quality from this point forward is pretty mediocre. If you're new, I promise it's not usually like this, so sorry, but today it's poor. We'll be back to normal in the next episodes.
We also have a guest on today, Anton Jäger, a BungaCast recidivist, and we're going to be discussing his article in Jacobin, From Bowling Alone to Posting On. Hey, Anton.
Hey, glad to be back.
Yeah, no, great to have you back. You're from a different place. You're in New York right now.
Yeah, I am. I'm on a Yankee exodus.
You're there to avoid distractions in a quiet little place called New York.
Exactly.
Get some work done.
Currently.
Yeah, excellent. So just a couple of quick things before we get properly started. You may have seen we have a listener survey out. Today would be, I think, when you're hearing this, the last day to fill it out. If you still haven't done so and would like to, we'd greatly appreciate that. The link is in the show notes. And for our Italian listeners, the Italian edition of our book has come out. It's just come out at the end of November, and there will be book launch events in Milan and Rome, probably on the 12th and 14th of January, but we'll confirm these dates as soon as they're nailed down, and we'll put out information, but hope to see you there. So to get properly kicked off, Anton, you've written this essay reflecting back on Robert Putnam's quite famous book called Bowling Alone, which came out in the year 2000. But your essay tries to develop that, talking about not just atomization, but how it affects politics, and really how this atomization entails a crisis of politics as an activity. So I think we'd maybe start off, firstly, Anton, just maybe I assume you've gone back and reread Putnam's book, but did it mark you maybe the first time you read it? Was there something kind of lingering? And Phil as well, for that matter, kind of some thoughts on the book, on what marked you about it.
I just remembered it as not just an undergraduate sort of textbook classic, but more as a meme or something that I even heard teachers at high school mention, in that it indicated a social scientific talking point or cliche that was around in the 2000s. But it was only in the course of the 2010s that I realized that maybe it was worth revisiting this book and seeing what the actual argument was and how it has held up, so moved beyond the memeified quality I was usually associated with it. And when I reread it, I was pleasantly surprised, but also depressed by how well it's held up. It's not just that many of the developments he diagnosed have become much worse, as Jacobin also put in the header, but that he predicts a lot of the developments in the 2010s, for example, around digitalization and the internet, which are actually quite impressive. So even though it's quintessentially a product of the 1990s and it very speaks to the civic crisis literature of the 1990s, it really seemed to speak to the present in many ways. And I think that was my real motivation for writing the piece, where I had the feeling that people hadn't actually properly celebrated bicentennial of the book's publication, and they hadn't actually been willing to reckon with what the book was saying and what it still was saying to us today.
Yeah, I mean, my kind of engagement with the text was somewhat different. I knew, I mean, it came out as I was, if I recall rightly, so it came out, or I became familiar with it at least roughly as I was finishing my undergraduate, but it was certainly, kind of, it imprinted itself on public and social scientific discussions at the time as being something significant. And I can't say that it's, this was still kind of even pre kind of .com crash. So I can't say that it really spoke to my everyday experience, not having lived in the West before my undergraduate education, and before kind of all the stuff on digitalization and all that stuff just seemed, I suppose, difficult to conceptualize how it might work. Chat rooms and MSN Messenger and Hotmail, and that was the kind of the era of the internet at the time, and the thought that that might become more than that, it was difficult beyond the kind of William Gibson style riffing. It seemed difficult to understand how that might change people's social interactions, short of fully inhabiting cyberspace. So I was aware of it. I was conscious of it. I read it as kind of as part of my undergraduate degree, though it wasn't wasn't quite a staple of the literature at the time, or at least I can't recall it being on any of my reading lists. I came across it as a result of participating in some conferences, but nonetheless, since then it became kind of a staple of my undergraduate teaching. So most of my kind of engagement with the idea outside of that kind of context has been in undergraduate teaching, and certainly it seems to resonate with students. And one way in which you can kind of track similar indices of that is, it's a quick straw poll in a seminar room of how many undergraduates are active members of societies. And I saw some statistics, I can't remember where, but kind of participation and membership of student life also shows the same kind of downward trend that all the Bowling Alone, any graph from Bowling Alone would show a similar kind of pattern. And so it was a way to kind of get to engage students to think about the social dimensions of politics. And I'm not saying that to belittle it or make it seem like it's purely kind of an academic talking point or a pedagogic kind of trick. I think it is, as Anton suggests, it is, has genuinely powerful insights, and it does need to be taken seriously in terms of its implications and consequences for not only, for social life, obviously, but also for political life, given that all the kind of political ideas and frameworks that we shuffle about and seem to kind of oscillate between are all inherited from eras, from mass society. And I still don't think anybody's really worked through the consequences of that disjuncture.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, actually, Anton, you saying that, you encountered it probably more as a meme. And I think that's probably right, because it is one of these, a book about structural social changes, which firstly is a type of thing which isn't kind of commonly discussed. Kind of pop sociology at the most probably will dwell on how people are kind of living online, or often kind of hand-wringing about what the contemporary world is doing to our kids. I think that's kind of a staple of pop sociological writing. But the one thing that people probably do not reflect on, and this book encouraged people to do so, is that question of membership in associations. Because things might be generally discussed as moving to the left or moving to the right, or that certain churches are growing or others are, shrinking. But that there is a mass transformation of the way that we socialize with one another is something that probably, unless you are, have done at least undergraduate sociology, is something that you're probably not going to reflect upon. And as Phil writes, it kind of underwrites, is a phenomenon that underwrites so much of politics, or the absence of politics, that it's worth reflecting on. And your essays, I think, really excellent in trying to tease out some of the more important and salient contemporary political consequences of that. So before we get on to the politics, I want to just briefly dwell on something which the book uses as a kind of analytic centerpiece, which is that question of social capital. And I think that's another one of those pop sociology terms, or sociological terms, which has been popularized, that people do tend to use, and probably tend to use in a fairly anodyne fashion to just mean, how many social connections you have. But you're critical of that lens in the essay. So why don't you tell us a little bit what your criticisms are?
Yeah, I've spoken about this with friends recently who've been pushing back quite heavily against my critique of this notion. They say this is just infantile leftism. This is a perfectly legitimate social scientific notion. Why would you object to it? And I guess one of the first reasons why he had to use that notion is just the demands of quantification. So if he wants to measure associational strength and these changes in associational life, you have to look for some kind of metric, and social capital is just one way of expressing that metric. So it's his way of saying associational density, and it's not really an injurious or a dangerous notion, and I don't think we should be that skeptical of it. Where I do think it's symptomatic of the 1990s, again, is that it speaks to a certain market-friendly sensibility, is that so much of the discussion about the crisis of civic life in the 1990s, and you saw this also in the Clinton administration with the welfare reforms or the fears over the decline of self-reliance, mainly Black communities, but also white communities, is that it's a purely instrumental interpretation of what social ties give you. So social ties are useful because they give you competitive advantages on the market. So as I said, if you were in a society or you worked for an NGO or you worked or were at a union or an association, that's handy for your college application and might be good for jobs. But that's a purely individualistic interpretation of what associational density actually gets you. Because what in the 20th century associational density gave you is not just control over the state, but also control over our collective economic and political life. And that insight is strangely absent in the Putnam book, just as he doesn't have a proper discussion of union strength, or, for example, there's no mention of the Volcker shock, there's no mention of deindustrialization, which were actually these massive moments that induce a crisis, not just for left-wing civil society, but also for right-wing civil society. And I even started reading into this, but if you look at the financial effects of the Volcker shock and the 1973 recession on the membership of some of these civil society groups, the results are actually pretty shocking, because, of course, associational life does also correlate with growth levels. The more money there is, the more easier it is to sponsor or to finance certain forms of group association. But then in the 70s and 80s, there's a sort of active push on behalf of capital for people just to get pushed out of these associations. And he buys into this marketization frame. But again, that doesn't detract from the fact that he's still onto something. There's a deep rational report to what he's saying. And what I always felt, certainly in the 2000s and 2010s, and certainly when I actually properly read the entire book last year, is that it resonated experientially in a very powerful way, not just with my experience of the 2010s, but even with my experience as a teenager in the 2000s. I just remember a really privatized, claustral world in which, of course, there were friendship circles, but which the world in which my parents grew up, in which the church and the party, whether it was a socialist party or Christian Democratic party, was this omnipresent factor in people's personal lives. There really was no distinction between public and private if you were a socialist or a Christian. And I always heard these stories from my parents and from my uncles, and I said, that is unimaginable to me. I can't even imagine a world in which something like a church or a party would have an active stake in your personal life. And when I reread it, I said, well, surely we need to talk about this more, because it seems so incredibly plausible to me that we should be having this discussion.
Yeah, I think one thing is the kind of tendency to look at this social question purely socially, right, and to cut out the politics, and that kind of always resolves itself into just a concern about the loneliness crisis, which I think is the contemporary way it's talked about, the people that it might just, the lack of associational density just makes people miserable. So it makes society not function well. And ultimately it's an analysis of society purely on kind of its own given terms. And I guess ultimately will be just about making the market function. And so one thing that struck me is a similarity of this discussion to one which is also very contemporary, which is the question of trust and concern about declining trust in society. And the two are very closely linked, and you might even say that the question of associationalism is foundational to the question of trust, right? So if people are memberships of organizations, they trust each other less. And a lot of the I think what hammers home the point about a certain small c conservative understanding of this, or the way that it's understood purely on social terms and not politicized, is the way that trust is always seen as a key asset. And the term asset is used appropriately, I think, a key asset for market society, right? That basically the market won't function very well if we don't have trust between actors, because everything then becomes litigated and wrapped up in the courts and so on. So it's I think it's important to try to extract the political.
But that's important, isn't it? For that is for a market-based society. Then that is important as to whether or not the market functions, right?
Yeah.
But are you suggesting it's you're suggesting it's bad? That it's only understood in terms of its relationship to the market?
No, I'm saying that ends up the default so if you're taking the bowling alone thesis, if you do not politicize it and understand it only socially, it will inevitably resolve into just a concern with the maintenance of market society and making market society work better, rather than concern with progress, let alone kind of any radical change to society.
But I think that's not that big of an issue insofar as I prefer a cultural sediment to market society that makes it function more smoothly and induces less anomie. And in that sense, it's just the right-wing reading of this problem, which is also a valid reading. I think we should just be clear, it's not our reading. We want to politicize it. We want to have a different version of what associational strength actually gets you, which is a possibility of collective change. But I think it's also, as I said in the piece, a massive crisis on the right. And if you look at how conservative parties are trying to relate to the changing culture of so many capitalist nations, it's very clear that the crisis of belonging and the crisis of membership also generates huge instability and volatility on parts of the right. It's almost like a Daniel Bell argument, right? The sort of cultural contradictions of late capitalism. But I think that's part of the story that Putnam is telling, is that the atomization which capital forced on the public sphere in the 80s and 90s also makes capitalist society much less manageable and governable. It generates all kinds of social pathologies, and it generates unpredictability, which is a problem even for people who want to just stabilize that society.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really good. I just wanted to, kind of just put a pin in that question, but maybe Phil, if you want to respond to it really quickly, because we're going to come back to it.
So this is part of the reason that Putnam was such a good teaching tool, is because it cut across expectations in terms of kind of left-wing and right-wing students, right? So, right-wing students, their kind of instincts were that the problems of sociability are to do with the left. And for left-wing students, their similar kind of instincts where their problems of sociability are the fault of the right. So if it's the fault of the left, it's kind of, identity politics or sexual politics or anti-family politics or suspicion of religion. And if you're on the left, then, it's the market, it's big corporations, it's manipulation by the media, and so on. So, and this is what was so effective for Putnam. And I think this speaks to, again, like to underscore, I guess, what Anton was saying, but it speaks to the fact he's identified a genuine trend that kind of destabilizes and scrambles your, what would be maybe if you took purely just kind of one set of political lenses to look at society, that this is, a long-term secular trend that affects society as such, and therefore, kind of cuts across the usual explanations that are still provided both by left and right for, problems of collective life.
Yeah, no, very good. And we're going to come back to the question, which is central to Anton's piece, about the extent to which, associationalism and its transformation matters to the right versus the left, to capital versus labor, and so on. Just to kind of illustrate it, I guess, a little bit more, because there's many people probably listen to this who maybe haven't read the book, but are vaguely familiar with the thesis or familiar with ideas that we've discussed on this podcast about atomization before. But just to tease out some strands to it. So I think firstly, just on parties, because you had already referred to that, Anton, in hearing accounts of how the party, whether socialist or Christian democratic, were so important in people's lives in a generation or two ago. It's interesting because when you read accounts of this, and people are saying, oh yeah, but parties used to be important, and you're contrasting that or setting that into dialogue with the question of bowling alone. So that you don't have bowling clubs anymore, for example, or lack of friendship. They seem so alien to each other because a political party sounds very cold and instrumental. I mean, it is literally it is an instrument. And so it isn't just purely about sociability for its own sake. So I maybe for a lot of people, it would seem that setting up parties as somehow a solution to the associationalism problem doesn't resolve the deep social crisis, even if it may seem to resolve a political one, right? How can a political party do anything like supplement friendships or sporting groups or volunteering?
Yeah, I don't think we need to just look at parties in this through an economist's lens. I think this is the issue, because parties are instrumental institutions, like unions are instrumental institutions. They're supposed to get you certain individual benefits, so people join them in this almost Ausonian collective action way, because they want to decrease the cost of certain individual approaches and therefore aggregate their force inside a party. So in that sense, what solution would it be for associational life if parties are just these money-making machines, or what you could call rent-seeking cartels, as some neoliberal economists would call them? But at the same time, when you actually see what the experience of party life is, certainly in the post-war period, even though they're instrumental, they actually provide much more than just an instrument for individual benefits. So I don't know whether you've read that French sociologist Didier Ribon's memoir, Returning to Reims, where he writes about his upbringing in a communist working class family in northern France in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And what's very striking about that book, or the way he describes his parents' lives within the PCF, is whether it's the revolutionary horizon or whether it's the material benefits, those are not the reasons for party membership. The reason you're in the party is because it's one of the only ways of building a social circle or having some type of social life on a daily basis. So it's about the neighborhood you live in, it's about the people you interact with. And he said it was more a social home than it was just an instrument of individual advancement, because we all know that the PCF, of course, had a very messy trajectory in government. And he also does admit that the PCF was homophobic, that it had certain anti-immigrant pulses that made it very difficult for him to sympathize with his parents' political sympathies. But what just comes through in the descriptions in the memoir is that it's so obviously not an instrumental or an exclusively instrumental institution. There is a kind of super contractual, I'd almost say sacrificial element to party membership, which is unimaginable today. Also because that's exactly what a party demands of people, is that at some point your individual well-being has to be made secondary to other political priorities.
Right. No, perfect. And I think that question, these questions actually today seem to get completely overridden by another discussion, which is basically the internet. And, is it the internet's fault? And I think you rightly note that there was a discussion kind of in the 90s and 2000s, which its main problem was the overestimation of what the internet could do, even politically. And we all know, kind of collectivism, as well as, calls to mass demonstration and Facebook's going to transform the world, to today's deep cynicism and pessimism about the internet across the board, really, about what it's doing kind of socially as well as politically, and the negative effects it has. I don't think you find, there's no kind of political grouping in society that you will find actively defending the internet as a solution. I mean, maybe there's some weird accelerationist types who might still do, but otherwise, no one's has any good things to say about the internet. I think the case against it is pretty obvious, right? So it's no longer bowling alone, it's streaming alone. I think you're right in the essay, it's very obvious the way that internet fills this void, because it provides this sort of pseudo connection online. And also, I think maybe even a sort of simulacra of power, because if you're streaming yourself from home, you can speak to multitudes. We say this as we record a podcast in various
As we
different
do a
locations of
podcast,
the
yes.
internet. Yeah.
Why are you criticizing podcasts?
No, I'm not. I love the simulacra of power that it provides me very dearly. I love
Oh,
it.
to mention the parasocial relationship is very important to podcasting.
No, indeed, no, and I've met very many good friends through this. So it plays on both sides, the social and the political. But I guess so. Like Anton, do you think? Is the internet discussion now too pessimistic, and how is there a way to rescue that, or should we just be ignoring the internet question entirely just because it becomes the norm, I guess, the social norm? It's no longer is this online or is this offline. The worlds are very integrated, hybrid now.
I think I was very confused about discussion for a really long time, and it took me a while to find a suitable frame to understand this, because, as I said, there are two really bad options, whether it's the internet optimism of the 2000s, in which both the crisis of political engagement or declining voter turnout, declining civil life will somehow be compensated by the engagement people can find online. And then there is the pessimism or the fatalism you see certainly after 2016, where the internet certainly becomes the monocausal source of all of these social ills, whether it's Trumpism, impotency, the incapacity for men to date women, or school shootings. You can suddenly pin all of this on the digitalization of our public sphere. And I think those frames are quite unsatisfying. And the powerful insight I hit up on at one point, I'm not sure who I was reading at the time, is what if we do not treat the internet as just a social technology or just a way of communicating, but actually as a social form itself, or as a type of association? What if we compare the internet to a political party, to a union, to a neighborhood group, or even to a church? And then you can see precisely the social role that it fulfills is to fill the void, as Brumaire called it, that was opened up in the neoliberal in the 1980s and 1990s, but how it both is a substitute and an exacerbation of this void. So this is where the Greek pharmacon noun comes in. It is a type of medicine you take to take care of disease, but which then actually exacerbates the disease itself. And I think that's a far more powerful, I'd say, social way of reading the internet. It's a sort of proper social theory of the internet, rather than a purely discursive or communicative one, which just sees it as a tool. Because I think that both underestimates and overestimates what the internet has done. It underestimates how bad the effects have been, but it also doesn't properly read it as a symptom of a crisis that predates the era of the internet itself. And experientially, I mean, there's so many examples. You just have to look at a group of teenagers sitting in a bar, all on their phones together, which is a sort of beautiful microscopic example of the lonely crowd you already got in the sociology of the 1950s and 1960s. Another example, which I always find quite telling, is that it took my sister and me half an hour to explain the concept of Tinder to my mom. And we just kept on telling her how it worked. And we said, and then you do this and it. And then she was just quiet for half a minute. And then she said, why don't you just go to the pub on a Friday evening? And that was a sort of beautiful example of how she was culturally completely alienated from this new social form. Because her sense was just, well, if you go to the pub on Friday evening, you'll get a sense of the sexual supply that's available in society. And then we had to explain to her, well, the pub doesn't function that way anymore. People can't just go to the pub for that reason. And Tinder does actually fill a void for the people who are too afraid to date or walk up to people to a pub on a Friday evening.
To add to what Anton said, I'm also thinking of all the times like I've been in a restaurant and seen people obviously on a date, both on their phones. And the bizarre, I guess I'm old enough to find that extraordinarily strange, even though I don't think and hope I'm not as, I don't think I'm as old as Anton's parents. But it is strange. I guess I don't know. Is it true though, it's not a question I guess we can answer, and we can't expect Putnam to answer it, but I guess I'd be curious to know what people think. Is it true that you wouldn't find, if you're looking for a date, you wouldn't find it if you went to the bar, because people have adapted to to expect the internet to supply that? Or is it that the internet simply kind of makes it easier to do, is more convenient, and therefore that's why you don't go to the bar?
I think it's both. I think there is a fear or a sort of tension that is introduced into a lot of social relations, which, as my mom said, or as my sister replied to my mom, yeah, sorry, but the bar you were talking about in the 70s and 80s simply doesn't exist anymore. So you can't supply that same potential for connection. While at the same time, I think what is very striking about the internet, and certainly about an app such as Tinder, is that it has an ideal of bourgeois contractualism built into it, in that it establishes prior consent even before social contact takes place. So the massive risk in my mom's time in the 70s and 80s is that a man would walk up to her on a Friday evening and engage in a conversation, and then you immediately have to make the choice: am I going to interact or engage with this person, or am I not to? And I can clearly see it in the social skills my mom has, is that she feels very easy just telling people to bugger off and not deal with her. So it introduces a real big element of risk in a lot of social contact, which the internet has, I would say, neutralized or sanitized, insofar as Tinder, and certainly also the online world, allows you to soften, or at least cut the hard edge of a lot of social interactions that are usually fraught with risk. So on Tinder, there's
but it cuts both ways, right? Because so the issue, because unsolicited dick pics, right? Like being a thing, so like, whereas before, presumably, like our parents' day, that is like, I mean, it's a crime, right? Kind of indecent exposure, or whatever the equivalent is in a different kind of legal context. And somebody who did that, everybody would recognize them as some kind of somebody who's mentally ill or a pervert, right? Whereas now, like, it's entirely normalized, and women, girls are kind of have to deal with it on a day-to-day basis. So it's, I guess it's odd, because it kind of phrase at both ends. So it's not just that you get the, like you say, kind of less risk associated with the possibility of rejection, or dealing with social awkwardness, or having to kind of personally turn somebody down instead of just swiping right, or swiping left, whatever it is on Tinder. But on the other hand, you also get kind of behavior that would have been seen as perverted behavior kind of becoming much more extreme, or extreme behavior becoming much more normal.
Yeah. It's very hard to. It's very hard to.
You can talk about this, Alex, right?
Yes. Unsolicited podcast invitations is about as far as I go, but it's very hard to lose face on the internet. You might feel a little bit ashamed, but it's very easy just to close the app and to kind of move on, right? Whereas losing face is like a permanent threat in real life social interaction. So I think it is just a kind of de-risking aspect, and it always has it's an easy solution. And of course, it desocializes you, because you become accustomed to having to do that, to have to chat someone up in a bar and face rejection and so on. Anyway, from unsolicited dick pics on to Donald Trump, which I guess is the kind of joke that they would make on some Tonight Show, U.S. Tonight Show kind of thing. But there we go. That's where Bunga's going these days. One of the kind of central questions in the essay, Anton, is the degree to which this is kind of the breakdown of associationalism is a plank on which fascism can walk, whether it supports authoritarianism or totalitarianism, and the extent to which what we have today with various forms of the new nationalist populist right can be called fascism. And so there's a whole big discussion on this, and we don't want to go, I think, maybe in too much depth into that one, because we've discussed this plenty on this podcast before, including with yourself and in various other episodes. So we don't need to repeat, I guess, those arguments in full. The the more fundamental one, I think, is the one that was already hinted at earlier, which is about to what extent associationalism and its decline matters and to whom it matters, right? So I think you put this nicely. Putnam was right, but for the wrong reasons. Associationalism matters for democracy, but it hardly matters to capital and might even threaten it. So do you think that it doesn't matter to capital? Because earlier we were saying that it can be the breakdown of associationalism, the breakdown of trust that implies also leads to a situation which can be unmanageable a bit for capitalism and its political representatives, because society becomes maybe too chaotic, too fractious, or whatever it might be. So does it matter to capital or not?
Again, I'm going to go for a cop out and say there's a contradiction on capital side there, and there's no pre-established interest that capital has in associationalism. I think economically, and you certainly see this in the 80s and 90s, the pulverization of civil society and what I call a controlled demolition of the public sphere, desocialization, creates genuine avenues or creates genuine commercial opportunities for capital, whether it's dating apps, whether it's delivery apps, whether it's, for example, all the kind of online or digital substitutes people look for in the internet. Those are all ways to make money. And Tinder and Grindr, or even OnlyFans, for example, are profit-seeking ventures which are based or are premised on desocialization. So in that sense, sections of capital certainly benefit from it. More importantly, I think capital benefits from disorganization. It just doesn't face a disciplined working class that would eat into its profit margins or would threaten its prerogative on investment. So in that sense, it's an obvious benefit. The way in which it's not a benefit, and that's where it's turned between the profit motive and the atmosphere of predictability or stability, which any capitalist society also requires, is the political management of a capitalist society becomes much more difficult in an era of associational decline. So as people are leaving associations, it becomes much harder to buy consent because these people are not within your parties. I think you can clearly see this within the Tory party in the last 10 years, which is actually the first mass party in European history. The Tories actually built their mass base before the German Social Democrats did. And them losing this base, as we see, actually generates massive volatility. I think the Brexit years show this very clearly because there's such a disjunction between the base and your cadre and the people who populate the state that you don't know what's actually happening in society. And suddenly you have this massive group of voters who vote for an option which the party itself and many of your backers are actually not that interested in. And I think you can see the same in the US, where American employers, because they find it much harder to build social bases within society, just faces a economy that's also more unpredictable. So again, the profit motive obviously drives capital in the direction of this organization, but their interest in stability or their interest in predictability means that they can't have, how should I say, it's not unambiguous. There are also massive problems involved.
Yeah. And I think, it depends also, in what sort of civic association we're talking about, because we can speak about it in blank terms and we can say that there's a general decline. And if you quantified it as social capital, then you can put it on a chart and see it declining pretty easily. But when you start to break it down a little bit more closely, there's obviously ones which are more right-wing and ones which are more left-wing. In fact, I'm kind of a little bit torn on as to whether to treat some civic associations as pre-political, not necessarily apolitical, but or never political, but pre-political, or whether they're always already political, and some things might be and some things might not be. And I think so. One interesting point you raised, or one example of a civic association which might be worth talking through a little bit as a kind of key example, is something like a local housing homeowners association, right? Because that would seem to be pre-political, or even non-political in some eyes, but it seems to me that will always lean in a certain direction because of the interests of the people grouped there in terms of home ownership, and especially in the sort of asset economy in which we live. And that's a case where it seems I think you point out that it doesn't really decline, right? That those homeowners associations probably are still relatively stronger than the whatever left-wing equivalent might be. And that has clear kind of political effects. And that would be one case where, the right is still doing okay because it still has its civic associations. but it's a mixed picture, because at the same time you also point out that loads of local conservative associations in the UK have really withered, right, and just become old folks' homes at best. So
I think the argument, which is also made, for example, about whiteness or the sort of white communities, which have so-called persisted into the neoliberal era, which provide the social basis for a right to continue to prosper. But that collapses two qualitatively different forms of association. So just think about what being a member of a Catholic church in the post-war period was like, or even being a member, for example, of a shop owners association. The question of discipline is completely different in those two organizations. The discipline that a homeowner association or that the leader of a homeowner association exercises on its members is completely different from the discipline a priest or a bishop exercises over its parishioners. And the left, it's also a cop-out for the left, because they say, oh, see, the right has just survived and therefore they're stronger. And I think, no, the real takeaway is even more traumatic. The right just needs fewer or less associational strength to be successful, because it has a default advantage in any capitalist society. And a homeowner association also has entry and exit costs, which are much lower than any of the associations which the right had. So I simply don't buy the equivalence between those two types of institutions. As I said, the Primrose League, which was this Tory neighborhood association that was founded in the 19th century, that persisted into the 50s and 60s, that was finally disbanded in the 2000s under the Ian Duncan Smith years, is just simply not comparable to a group of asset owners in a provincial English town whose value is maintained by the low interest rates of the Bank of England. That is not the same associational infrastructure that the Tory party used to have. And pretending that they're the same is strategically very dangerous.
I've got a separate question though, Anton, which is the so I take the point obviously about the kind of the political aspects of it and the question of ordered social life that involves some degree of sacrifice and commitment. But nonetheless, that there is, this is a point that Michael Lind put to us, or kind of when we spoke about kind of these related phenomena. He said, well, that collapse, the Putnamite collapse that you've seen, has been much more severe for the left, or at least for the working class, than it has for the middle classes and the wealthy. And and this is connected to those arguments about, say, marriage, for instance, right? So, the middle classes have kind of delegitimized and devalued marriage, which turned out, to be kind of much more important for working class people as a kind of source of social support, given relative, greater economic insecurity, whereas the middle classes kept on marrying, even while they, kind of delegitimized it as a source of patriarchal oppression of women, limiting women's career chances and what have you. And so they get the benefits of, they get the benefits of both of women's entry into the workforce at the same time as maintaining the kind of dual income and, social support structure that comes with long-term bonding. So in that context, isn't it, even if you have the kind of decline of those organizations such as the Primrose League or conservative party branches, you still have greater social connectivity among, say, the better off? At least, I might be wrong, but I'm assuming that the data would bear this out, that you have greater kind of social connectivity among the better off, and in times of greater inequality and less social mobility, those things also become self-reinforcing. And this is, Branko Milanovic has made this point with respect to the, marrying within your class. You can see the data for this kind of entering these self-reinforcing patterns over time. So it ends up strengthening all these effects around asset accumulation, inheritance, and so on. It becomes a vicious, so the Putnamite effect actually creates a vicious cycle economically.
Oh, definitely. It becomes a driver of inequality in its own right. Certainly with the social endogamy you describe, and that class reproduction becomes much more contained. I definitely think that middle-class associational life has weathered this era much better, partly because they have more market power. So it's just you have more money to sponsor and to support your remaining institutions. And this is a thing you already see in the 70s and 80s. Working class institutions like unions are much more susceptible to economic downturns because people's wages decline and then they can't pay their dues, and that means that the unions start to suffer economically, while the middle classes have more economic reserves, so they can keep on financing this. And the marriage question, the friendship question, just the family stability question are all examples of this. Nonetheless, despite this persistence, and I also agree about this, for example, with police unions, which are very strong in the US, the constituency of the carceral state, etc., all of those have weathered this era much better. But what I don't buy is the idea that it is in any way comparable to the associational strength which conservative institutions used to have. And it is still a very sensitive and important decline, which generates the volatility on the right we've been discussing on that podcast. And this is what I want to talk about insofar as, yes, there is inertial power to middle class life, both on the left and the right, but there is still a massive crisis, which the right has no answer to. And I've seen several right-wing intellectuals reposting my Putnam piece and questioning the very idea that the left has suffered most from this. And I was flabbergasted by this because being brought up in the world of the left hemisphere, it just seems very clear that we are the real victims here. But they say, no, actually, it's been even more catastrophic on the right. And I guess it depends on who they see as the natural basis for the right. They say, like, no, this is a more severe crisis on the right because the right has even more truly lost its bearings. And I think they're also talking interestingly about the cultural hegemony of a certain middle class left that has managed to hold on to power more.
Right. So I was that very good, because I wanted to get onto that exactly, because the lack of class cohesion amongst the bourgeoisie is a facet of the absence of a systemic challenger, right? Because it's not facing the working class. You can become much more fractious between different cultural alignments, production alignments, whatever, in between the bourgeoisie, between owners of capital. But to take kind of the right more broadly, so not just owners of capital, I think because they don't have an obvious economic political challenge to be that they face in terms of imposing discipline at work, or trying to damp down pushes for rising wages or anything like that, any of the kind of traditional struggles against labor. The one area where the lack of associational density actually matters is in culture, because those associations used to provide the social ballast which could resist certain kind of forms of social liberalization and cultural liberalization. So now, society is completely defenseless against Hollywood, to put it in kind of the terms of, American culture war tropes. And not just Hollywood today, of course, but, all the kind of wokeness, for example.
Talk about the attempt to found right-wing universities. A very good example of this. Where the cultural power of the left within these middle-class institutions or these Mandarin institutions means that the right is completely powerless in this institutional landscape.
Yeah, exactly, and that's where the thing really starts to bite for the right. But ultimately, in the long run, it's okay, right? I guess it can survive in that, and the imbalance there, the inherent imbalance between right and left, comes to bear because it can still rely on capital to do its work forward in terms of imposing discipline and so on in economic terms, even if it loses very much in cultural terms. And I think probably that is, in some ways, explains a lot of contemporary politics and why politics has been dragged also onto the train of culture.
Where is the discipline and how is that working? It seems like the Tories are very likely going to lose the next election in the UK, partly because they're damaged by the wave of kind of Labour militancy that we're going through here in the UK at the moment. They're looking at ways to kind of forestall it by raising the threshold in certain sectors for what count for allowing strike activity to go ahead to raise it from 40% to 50% in certain professional sectors, but you're not looking at them kind of sending out the the police to break down picket lines or something like that, or to get scab workers into particular sections. I mean, I don't see any evidence of the kind of highly organized, smoothly functioning, well disciplined, and strategized response that you had in the 80s to and obviously the labor challenge is much less, but nonetheless I just don't see the evidence of the organization and the discipline that you're indicating, Alex.
No, I'm sorry, let me just to be absolutely clear, the discipline that capital imposes does through the force of competition, completely impersonal force. I'm not saying that
so it's nothing to do with
bodies.
Political management.
No, exactly not. I'm just saying that the right doesn't need to the same degree the dense network of associations as the left, because ultimately it's more or less going along with what capital wants, whereas the left goes entirely against it, and the only thing that it has is the force of numbers and organization, solidarity. And that's all the left can rely on. So there's obviously an inbuilt imbalance there. And so because of that, and because of the attenuation of class struggle, the right doesn't even need so much that dense network of associations for political management today, because it doesn't need to face down, organized labor in the same way. But it does leave it completely gaping, in the face of a cultural onslaught, let's say. And so, the kind of cultural conservatism faces no defenders, and that's where the decline of associationalism really bites for the right.
The reason I feel like it doesn't quite work is because it seems to me like, that cultural onslaught, as you put it, is very conducive. I mean, and this is something we've talked about many times. Identity politics is very good for carving out new markets in this kind of highly competitive thing. So, the idea that it's some kind of counter power or threat. I mean, it's a threat to kind of cultural conservatives.
But that's what I'm talking about, because because we're talking about the right, and especially the kind of concerned with cultural conservatism, not just capital. And so I'm making that distinction, right? In the same way that you wouldn't identify the left with the working class necessarily.
Because but the thing, I suppose, the point is what they're so what the kind of the university secessionists, or the kind of right-wing secessionists that are trying to kind of establish institutions which aren't dominated by the Mandarins or the Brahmins, what they're doing is they're responding to what they think is kind of a deranged left and a kind of, new Red Guard kind of Maoism. And, there's some truth to that, because it does have elements of that, though obviously, nothing like the extremes of Maoist China, and with no real kind of organic connection to that political legacy. But what they're really responding to me, it seems to me, is an economic, it's kind of the cultural froth of certain economic processes, right? So, which are part of and kind of, it's that kind of the economic aspect of the anomie that we've been talking about manifests itself in this way. So that's actually what they're responding to. They understand it as a left on the rampage, when in fact it's a cultural kind of corollary of an economic effect.
But just to leave myself clear, the thing that the right is concerned about ultimately, or the point at which it deviates from what capital wants, if you can put it in those terms, is on the cultural side, right? And that's why hence the university secessionism. So even if they misidentify it as merely the left on the rampage, and rather than something that is thoroughly sort of bourgeois and of a piece with capitalism's own operations, the cultural thing is where it matters for them, and that's why it's the terrain of struggle for the right.
I agree with Phil that it's not nearly as agential as parts of the people on the right make it seem. It is a much more impersonal economic process that maybe can be encouraged or enhanced by actors on the left. So certain cultural trends within late capitalism obviously have supporters or fanboys on the left, but the right tries to personalize it too much insofar as they're looking for blame allocation, or they want to find the person that's actually driving this, when it's the course of our current economy that's generating all the cultural pathologies they're so worried about. And as you say, the middle class as a bloc has also had a particular cultural transformation in the last 40 years, because the middle class throughout the 20th century actually used to be quite nationalist and conservative, or organized around domestic states. Now the middle class is quite internationally branched, actually has a much more cosmopolitan outlook. That's also a massive change. And in 1926, during the general strike in Britain, they actually got, I think, Oxford students to drive some of the trams and buses
They did, yeah,
across
to
London.
organize even kind of volunteer firemen,
Yeah,
kind of from the middle classes, which is just, I mean, inconceivable.
it's
today,
inconceivable
right?
today. Just imagine a Oxford graduate nowadays replacing an RMT driver on some of the southeastern railways. And that, I think, is a beautiful indication of how we've moved, is the right simply can't go to the university anymore to look for strikebreakers, because that associational infrastructure has gone.
Yeah, very good. Maybe to close this off with a kind of final sort of reflection, which is maybe a historical one. So you obviously you referred to the way that Marx described the peasants in the 1848 revolution as a sack of potatoes. I'd written potatoes rather than potatoes, which I guess, maybe you can use that as a new verb. Who are the potatoes today? What are the forces turning us into merely a sack of potatoes, atomized and therefore subject to the appeals of a strong leader, because we're not able to form our own associations. Actually, just to extend the potato thing, I guess we're also, not just gathered in a sack, but gathered on a couch, couch potatoes. So yeah, I think we can work with this potato sort of theme. You point out that instead of peering aimlessly at the 1930s, referring to this discussion about fascism, about whether Trump's a fascist or blah, 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 we would have to look at a much old and primal age of democracy for suitable parallels with our populist era. So I thought that was convincing, or at least, appealing, at least as a way of turning us away from this endless 1920s, 1930s discussion, which is, as you say, a much more different world to ours than maybe, the 1840s. Now, I don't think you're making an argument to go fishing for other historical parallels, because as a way of exploring our time, because you can spin out a million think pieces from it, but I'm not sure how much it illuminates. But nevertheless, I think maybe there is something there. So maybe talk us through what we have to learn from the primal age of democracy.
I think we've all become peasants, or so much of contemporary politics is an equivalent of what used to be called peasant politics. Because what's very specific about peasants is not just the individual ethic, but also the lack of an experience of social labor, the lack of a certain experience of cooperation, which is very endemic to the current informal economy. And there, the sack of potato story holds up very well. Where I would caution against the 19th century parallel, and what I probably want to think about more, is that there are two big differences. Is that was an era of democratization or suffrage struggles. So that was an era of democratic ascent rather than democratic decline. And that does make it very different insofar as the basis for militancy on the necessity of democratization are simply much more difficult to organize today, because of course there's been de-democratization, but you can't galvanize or mobilize people in the same way with the promise of democracy. And the other is, of course, that the 19th century was a period not just of an ideology of progress, but it didn't have the 20th century behind it, but also one in which economic growth and industrialization were still very prevalent. And those two factors are completely absent today. So if you want to talk about Bonapartism as a sort of default mode of capitalist governance, it makes sense to go back to the 19th century. But for the rest, there are also real limits to this frame, which I want to think about, in that we're in a much more hybrid and more difficult world, as I said in the round table around your book, which really defies all of the categories we've inherited both from the 19th and the 20th century. And that can become an excuse for really annoying exercises in novelty, but it can also be a challenge to just think very hard about the specificity of the moment we're facing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the famous thing about the peasants, they can't represent themselves; they must be represented. There's the famous Marx line from the 18th Brumaire: the weight of the French peasantry is brought in order to, both electorally and in terms of foot soldiers, is brought in to crush the the urban working class in the context of mid-19th century France. And that's the basis for Bonapartism. I mean, the difficulty is it's based on the political economy of the peasant household in, agricultural France, mid-19th century France, prior to the industrialization, that would come subsequently. So whereas we have the kind of the lack of, we have all the political anomie, this, I think, and perhaps, I'm not sure that the kind of the service sector, or even kind of many swathes of what are seen as kind of white collar jobs, don't have, or it's simply not the same that kind of segmented political economy of the self-sufficient agricultural household.
No, absolutely
It's
not.
a very different political economy. And so you have the strange effect, like you say, of kind of the juxtaposition of kind of a political enemy and the populism that comes with it, alongside an underlying political economy that is very much the opposite of self-sufficiency. I mean, there's no way to kind of stream alone without presupposing an enormous kind of infrastructure and complex integrated division of labor, even at a global level, if you think about the internet, So that's that is kind of the peculiar contradiction of the time, I guess.
So let me just add, peasant self-sufficiency was still an economic reality in the 19th century, even when there's credit dependence in some ways. So their lack of experience with social labor is how Marx says that their political action becomes so difficult, because they don't have an experience of cooperative labor, so they don't have a cooperative notion of politics. It's purely serial or atomistic. But today, if you're looking at the service economy, even if its experience is highly individualistic, so you're sitting in front of a laptop as part of the laptop class working on something, the work you do is hyper-social, is part of a division of labor which is even more complex and mediated than anything that comes before in history. And that is an extremely strange hybrid, because politically you're a peasant, but economically you're basically a cyborg. It's a sort of peasant cyborg.
That's good. But the dangerously close to the techno-feudal thesis there, Anton.
Yeah, indeed.
Oh, no, I just stumbled on. Oh, Jesus, I don't know how we got here. I'm so sorry.
All right. Very good. Unless you guys have anything you want to add, I think this has all underlined the importance of unifying, maybe not as mashed potatoes. I think mashed potatoes would be a fascist dish. It's this organic, undifferentiated mass. But maybe we have to bind ourselves together like potatoes might be in a gratin, for example. So I think that should be our political.
French fries is a Belgian invention.
Right, but they're not necessarily bound together. They're just in a container together, whereas a gratiné, creates that dense bonds, holds us together, and is strong, hard to break apart, but yet retains the graduality of the potatoes. No, those are still just, that British solution is still just atomized. No, I think we definitely have to be a gratin.
We're coming to Christmas, Alex, and roast potatoes. So who will speak for the roast potatoes? Who will stand for the roast potatoes on this podcast?
That and the gammon next to it, yeah.
Yeah, well, we don't have the gammon today, so someone's going to speak for the roast potatoes.
All right, very good. Maybe we'll leave the gratin to 2023. Thank you, everyone, for listening to BungaCast in 2022, and especially to our subscribers on Patreon. We really do appreciate every day the engagement that you have with what we do, and there's plenty more to come from us in 2023, so stick around. If you don't subscribe already, please do so, and if you'd like to review us wherever you get your podcast, we'd greatly appreciate 5 stars. We're back in the new year with reflections on the key themes of 2022 with Ashley Frawley. We're going to have Dylan Riley on to talk about capitalism and democracy, actually rather similar themes to what we've been discussing here. We've got an episode coming out on degrowth and much, much more. So we'll see you on the other side. Everyone have a lovely Christmas or whatever you may celebrate, and see you then. I just went PC there, Christmas or whatever you may celebrate. It should just be Christmas. Suck
Should have just said Winterval.
Yeah. Winterval, yeah.
Winterval. Yeah.
And this is it's part of the war on Christmas. It's good.
Yeah.
Rabat ou Panama, La Paz ou Ottawa, Islamabad on fait le bunga.